Thank you. The outside world provides an overwhelming amount of information to our brains. However, we are well able to reach our goals, say, find a seat to rest. So how do we do that? Top-down attention is the brain function that allows us to select relevant information and filters out irrelevant noise. I have seen this already. Okay. I'm sorry. Okay, this is top-down attention. It filters out irrelevant information and boosts relevant ones. For example, the seat and the table if you want to rest. So finding the networks that support this function is critical to understand how humans orient in the outside world and how they plan actions. So what do we know about the networks of attention? Classical studies of visual attention have shown areas in the dorsal part of the brain, like the lateral intraparietal area, which I will call LIP, and the frontal eye field, which I will call FEF, as sources of attentional information, both in humans and macaques. However, recent evidence is showing that also an area in the ventral part of the brain, in the temporal lobe, the posterior inferior temporal dorsal area, which I will call PITD, is also involved in this function. Here is the evidence from various rival labs at the Rockefeller University. Macaques were instructed to perform a motion discrimination task in random dot stimuli, and on top of that, attention was manipulated and was either paid to the left or to the right hemifield. By using a whole brain functional MRI approach in block design, attentional modulation was isolated. Beside activation in the dorsal part of the brain, area LIP, and beside activation in early visual cortices, which we know are modulated by attention, also activation, even stronger than activation in LIP, in fact, was found in the lower bank of the STS in area PITD. Critically, PITD was not modulated by motion, the task-relevant dimension, thus suggesting a more general role of this area, not bounded to any specific feature of the outside world. And PITD was not modulated by other specialized stimuli like phases or objects. And this shows that this area has a functional profile which is profoundly different from that of nearby areas and more similar to LIP. So the presence of a ventral node for top-down attention opens a number of questions. For example, does a comparable ventral attention node exist in humans? And is this ventral node interconnected with dorsal attention areas to form a network that would possibly negotiate a common focus of attention? To answer the first question, we used the very same approach used for the macaque monkeys, that is motion discrimination task and attention being manipulated on top of that in fMRI settings. We scanned the activity, brain activity of 10 subjects. And to first understand what were the areas generally involved in the task, we compared a condition in which the subjects were fixating with a condition in which the subjects were performing the task. And we found activation, this is a flat map of the human brain, group analysis, in frontal cortices, in parietal cortices, as expected, early visual areas, and activation here in the temporal lobe. But to be more specific, we compared a condition in which attention was paid to the left and attention was paid to the right, so to isolate the attentional component and get rid of visual stimulation, motor response, and so on. And here is what we found. We found activation in the posterior part of the intraparietal sulcus, as expected, in an area comparable to macaque LIP. We found activation in the empty plast complex, which is coding for motion, the task-relevant dimension, and it's known to be modulated by attention. And we also found an activation here at the posterior end of the occipitotemporal sulcus in an area which has been previously referred by a retinotopic study from Guyorban as putative human PITD. So critically, this area here was not modulated by motion, which you can see here in violet. The task-relevant dimension, thus again suggesting a more general role in attention, was not modulated by other specialized stimuli like phases, scenes, or objects. And therefore, it was shown to be pretty similar to the macaque PITD that I showed before. So yes, human temporal cortex has an attention node, possibly playing a more general role in attention, and that may be in a critical location to gather information about static properties of objects. So the second question was, is this ventral node interconnected with dorsal attention areas? In fact, co-activation in fMRI study can happen for a number of different reasons. For example, a common source from outside the brain, like the visual stimulus, a common source from inside the brain, with those nodes not being physically connected, or it could result from direct connections between the nodes. And this is what we wanted to test. So to test whether there are structural connections, we use diffusion MRI. In the macaque, we extract the brain which were functionally mapped, and we perform scan at high field, scanning for long periods of time, up to 74 hours, to gain high angular and spatial resolution, which was as low as 250 microns. In humans, we used a large dataset approach by using a platform, brainlife.io. We implemented a pipeline to scan the attention connections over 1,000 subjects. On both datasets, we applied ensemble probabilistic stratigraphy, and we reconstructed the connections between specific attention nodes. Also, we wanted to test the pathways that this connection could take. For example, the connection between PITD and LIP could either run through the vertical occipital fasciculus in the posterior part of the brain, or more anteriorly through the vertical limb of the inferior longitudinal fasciculus. This is a piece of evidence that is typically not available in traditional anatomical studies, but that can be understood by using diffusion MRI and has important clinical relevance. And finally, by performing this approach in two different species, we wanted to know whether the existence of this ventral node and its connection would share similar organizing principles across species. Here is the macro-scale evidence for direct connection between PITD and LIP here in yellow, and PITD and frontal eye field here in cyan in macaque monkeys. We found the core of the tract in the very same position in different subjects and hemispheres for a total of 8 hemispheres. When we tested alternative hypotheses about the pathway that connection would take, we found that this posterior vertical connection was not running through the vertical occipital fasciculus, but rather more anteriorly through the VILF, and the temporal frontal connection was not running through the arcuate fasciculus, but rather more ventrally, first through the ILF and then through the extreme capsule. When we asked the same question in humans, we found again direct connection between PITD and LIP and PITD and FEF. Similarly to the macaque, we found that this vertical tract was mostly running anteriorly through the temporal-parietal connection, but differently from the macaque, the temporal-frontal connection was mostly running through the arcuate fasciculus and not ventrally through the IFOF. And this stands as a difference between the two species that might be accounted by the way this posterior part of the brain expanded. In summary, here I showed you the first connectivity model functionally and structurally defined across two species of top-down attention. We found that attention is not limited to dorsal frontoparietal structure. We found that there is also a ventral node, and this ventral node is connected through direct connections to the dorsal attention areas. We ascribe a new function, the communication of top-down attention signal, to two vertical fiber bundles, and this highlights the importance of vertical interaction across the brain. Let me go one step further here. When we use our attention in the outside world, we capitalize on information about spatial properties, which are coded in the dorsal visual stream, and static object properties, which are typically coded in the ventral visual stream. Having connections between critical attentional nodes, both in the dorsal and ventral part of the brain, provide a possible explanation as to how we are well able to gather together different pieces of information from the outside world to perform a successful attentive behavior. With that, I would like to thank all the people and institutions involved in this study, Mirich Freival and Aiko at Rockefeller University, Franco Pestilli, along with three of his talented students at Indiana University, and Henning Voss and Erika Ronowitz at Weill Cornell Medical College for setting up sequences for the ex vivo brain. Please visit the poster today if you want to know more about this topic, and tomorrow if you want to know more about brainlife.io. Thank you for your attention.